What do Napoleon, a sword, and champagne have to do with globalization? We'll talk about that next on Global Perspectives.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Garcia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
Hello and welcome to Global Perspectives. Globalization is a word we've all come to know, and trade is one of its major components. The making and movement of goods around the world has an effect on people from all walks of life everywhere. Where do the products we buy originate? What goes into creating them, shipping them, and ultimately purchasing them? Today's guest can help us wrap our heads around these questions and more. Award-winning author and radio commentator Rachel Louise Snyder has spent the majority of her career in journalism, traveling the world in search of the stories at the heart of many of today's issues. Her book, Fugitive Denim, a moving story of people and pants in the borderless world of global trade, is a real-world account of what goes into making the clothes we all wear and the far-reaching impact of that process. Hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Your book and your life sound like an adventure. And give us a sense of how that adventure started and where it took you along the way.
That's a big question. It's tough to know where to start because life is really just made up of moments, you know, not an aha moment for me, but I did, when I was an undergraduate university, I went on a program called Semester at Sea. This was more than 20 years ago now, and it was the first time I'd ever left the country. My first night away from America was during a typhoon in Japan. I was stuck in a train station in Kobe. And then I was off to a roaring start, really. I knew from that moment that I wanted to save England and France and Italy and Germany for when I was older. And I wanted to go to the places that fewer people go to. Of course, now I know that lots and lots of people go to those places, but my perception at the time was that I would be doing something very adventurous. And I discovered, I started like everybody. I saved my money and I went backpacking, and I would go to ruins. I would, go to Tikal in Guatemala, and I would go to Chichen Itza or these ruins, and they never spoke to me the way the stories of people did and the struggles of those people. And so I just started to think of ways in which I could, be a mouthpiece for those stories.
And some of them are just amazing because you pick a slice of what's happening and then you literally get into it yourself. You live with the people, you observe them, and you really begin to understand their situations. Can you give us an example of one that was especially compelling for you?
People have often said of my work that instead of having a 30-foot view of globalization, I have a 3-foot view, or maybe 3 inches even, I don't know. But I feel like the individual lives of a single person can tell, a much larger story, and that's what I always try to do. I've met 13-year-old Romanian gypsies who were married. I've met survivors of terrible natural disasters, and those people tend to stay with me. I think one woman that I spent a fair amount of time with was some years ago in Romania. She was a doctor, and she performed illegal abortions under Ceausescu and the Ceausescu regime. She could have lost her life for this, and it was a real, she spent more than a decade living in fear, and yet had this profound faith that what the regime was doing was wrong, forcing women essentially to have multiple children. I also met a 32-year-old grandmother when I was there. Her story sort of stays with me because I haven't had a life where I've been challenged in that way, where the stakes have been that high. And I think she's one of the people I think about when I go back. Just different people around the world have come back to me. Of course, a lot of Cambodians, actually, a lot of Cambodian stories since I lived there.
But your book takes us deep into the globalization issue and debate, and we're not going to resolve that today, but very interested in what your perspective was on globalization going in and how it changed in a few significant ways once you had done substantial research on the ground.
I think, you know, one of the things about globalization that just seems so strange to me is the way in which we frame the conversation as if it's something new. I mean, Marco Polo was engaged in globalization. The East India Tea Company was globalization. So the debate seems misguided to me in some way. Like, you know, is it good, is it bad? It's been with us for centuries. And so the question isn't, to me, starting out the question wasn't, is it good or bad, but what's wrong with it and how can we address those issues, because it's here and it has been here for many, many years. It might be moving a little faster today. Everything is moving a little faster today. So that I knew was the frame in which I wanted to go about my research. I also grew up, I mean, I went to college right around the time that sweatshops were starting to get press, like the early 90s. As an idealistic young college student, I would protest, or I would say, I'm not going to buy from this, place. And so I was sort of aware of sweatshops, and because I had that awareness, I wanted to go beyond that and find out what else was in the industry, what else was happening, were these multinational buyers as evil as they seemed, but also, and perhaps more importantly, how can I connect what I find out there in the world to my life here in America, to our life. I come from a family on my father's side of very devoted Walmart shoppers, and I did not want to castigate people for whom that plays a very necessary economic need in their life. And so I just think, I probably approached it like I approach anything, with a little bit of humility and willingness to be wrong, in a sense. And I was wrong again and again, One of the more amazing moments for me, actually, and this is really kind of a minor thing in the book, but I felt like it was important for me as a journalist in a way, was one day I went to a factory in China that was making clothes for Eileen Fisher, a kind of upscale women's brand, and I was going with a third-party auditor, which is someone who goes in and they do training sessions with garment workers, or they audit factories, or perform some sort of human rights training or something like that. And they were doing 10-session trainings on various topics. So for 10 weeks, once a week for 2 hours, the garment workers would all come out and they would learn about whatever. And so I'm driving there, and I say to my translator, "What's today's subject?" And she says, "Comity." And I was like, comity? Like, I'm familiar with that word. She must be using that wrong. Like, how many people use that in everyday conversation? Nobody I know. So I for the whole ride there, I kept saying, like, comity, are you sure? I mean, that's, it must be human rights, or it must be like workers' rights, or, what they're, what they need to advocate for themselves. I mean, I just was convinced that she was wrong. And we got there, and the very first thing the teacher said to this group of about 300 Chinese garment workers was, the proper way to clap is not like this, and not like this, but like this. And I, you know how hard it is to get a journalist visa to China. I thought, oh my God, I've wasted my journalist visa. Like, what am I doing here? This is such a waste of my time. I already know how to clap, And I just, the whole 2 hours, I mean, it was like they learned about the oily T-zone in your face. They learned that if you're asked to ballroom dance by a boy chewing gum, you should say no because he doesn't have any manners. The average length of a step is the length of one's own foot. I mean, this was what the lesson was, and I thought, oh God, what a waste of time. This is a whole chapter of the book. So I went back. At the time I was living in Cambodia, and I went back and I started to call Chinese scholars at universities in America. I called probably 5 people at UC Berkeley, because I know they had a big Asian studies program, saying, like, can you put this in some sort of cultural context? I mean, I don't know what I was doing there. Even the third-party auditor said, that seems like a strange lesson. We thought it'd be on human rights or something, you know. But I just couldn't let it go. I thought, there has to be a reason why they were doing that lesson. I just am not getting it. Nobody was able to answer it, and I pondered it and pondered it and pondered it. And actually, one day then, it came to me, not from a scholar, but because I knew that I was misunderstanding something and I didn't know what it was. And it was probably 2 months later that it came to me. And I thought, you know, these girls, by and large, they're 16, they're from the countryside, this is the first time they've ever been away from home. They're living on their own in dorms, right? They're far away from their families. What did I want to learn when I was 16? Of course I wanted to learn how to talk to boys. Of course I wanted to learn how to negotiate successfully a world in which I didn't understand, you know, that I was just entering. And suddenly, it didn't at all seem like a waste of time to me. It seemed like a very important lesson. And I'm really happy that I stayed with that. Like, I'm sort of proud, and also I feel like, once again, you know, a sense of humility and not letting something go. Like, it's a lesson I have to learn all the time. And
Absolutely. Now, you've also been in some very dangerous locations, places where wars have been fought or are being fought. How did you feel in those locations relative to others, and were you ever worried about your personal safety?
I have been worried about my personal safety a couple of times. You know, my husband and I like to joke about, he teaches hostile environment training to journalists. He met me at Heathrow on my way to Afghanistan with body armor, you know, which I picked up and immediately dropped because it weighed about 100 pounds. And I thought, heaven help me, I'll just be a divot in the ground if I ever have to put this thing on. But also having his training and having him in the house for, you know, extra credit has made me really aware of not pushing those boundaries. You know, I've never been a kind of hee-haw journalist going after the hottest story. So when I went to Kabul, for example, I wasn't sure what story I was going to cover, and I ended up spending at least 2 weeks in the Kabul jail for women in the prison there. And theirs was a story that really wasn't getting told. You know, they're in prison with their children because, of course, in many countries around the world, it's the woman's responsibility to take care of the kids. And if she is incarcerated because her husband's been killed and she refused to marry her brother-in-law, the kids go with her. And so, you know, I'm in this prison. They let me come in and sort of hang out with these women. And so I guess I've primarily been a magazine journalist, not a newspaper journalist, and so, or radio as well. And so I've looked for stories that are kind of in unexpected places in those situations. I also learned really pretty much after Afghanistan that I'm not, I don't have the gene, I don't have the war gene, especially now that I have a kid. I just don't want to cover those kinds of stories. The stories that stayed with me more were natural disasters, in particular, you know, the Asian tsunami. I spent about 3 weeks in Aceh, Indonesia, and I went around one afternoon with the truck collecting bodies, and that, you know, that afternoon stays with me. And
so, are you working on another project as we speak that you can talk about a little bit, or?
I can talk about it a little bit. I just finished a second book. It's a novel, actually, so it didn't require any sort of adventure travel. And then my third book, which I'm just starting to research now, is on risk and predictions. So one of the things I'm looking at is this group in Massachusetts who have figured out a way to predict and thus prevent domestic homicide with wild success. And you know, they're sort of looking at the post-shelter world. What can we do for victims? And they're doing really interesting work. And I'm looking at other kinds of things that we predict as well, and what it means, you know, how much control we really have over those things. You know, we put out flu predictions every year. We put out natural disaster predictions, but really, ultimately, I'm not sure we really have control over that. So that's what I'm working on now.
Fascinating. And you mentioned earlier that the natural disaster environments compelled you, perhaps more than others. Is that something that developed as you went along, or did you go into this with more of a focus on those?
Well, I don't have journalism training as such. I was a creative writer and an avid traveler. So it took a while for those paths to kind of converge in a way that made sense in terms of a career. But I have a little bit of a sordid past myself. I left home at 16, high school dropout, and I went to a college in which I could explain why I didn't have a high school diploma. And the guy who accepted me, the admissions officer, is now the vice president of the college, and I'm their big success story. A little tiny college, North Central College in Illinois. And really, what I was asking for from him was a second chance, and what he offered me was a second chance. And in that school, I took a class in Harlem Renaissance literature, where I was introduced to James Baldwin for the first time. And I remember being 19 and reading this line from James Baldwin: "The most dangerous creation of any society is the man who has nothing to lose." And that's actually, I mean, it's ridiculous in a way, but it's what I felt like when I was 14, 15 years old, 16. I lived in my car for about 6 months, actually. And so when I traveled, those were the connections I was making. I think people who felt in some way like they no longer had anything to lose. And I don't know if I would have articulated it as such, but I just was drawn to that. And I would often go, I remember I used to write for the Chicago Tribune a lot in the early days, and I remember wanting to go cover Hurricane Mitch in Honduras, and I had just been to India. In fact, I was in India while Hurricane Mitch was happening, which I think was in October of '98, and I told the Chicago Tribune, I want to go cover Hurricane Mitch, and this was like 2 months later in December, and they said, that story's over. I mean, that's nothing's happening there. And that was exactly why I wanted to go, because I thought, it's not over for them, And so I went. I spent about 6 weeks there, and I wrote about it. And so I think that's where my personal life sort of compelled me in terms of where my professional life took me, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, when your book was written, we were already in a period of tumultuousness in the global economy, and things have gotten much worse. The haves and the have-nots are probably separated by a greater divide. And even though globalization is a reality and it continues to accelerate, realistically, the benefits of it are not going to reach the majority for a long time, and some say maybe not ever. And so how do you make the case to people who have been marginally affected by globalization and who have little or no potential to receive any benefits from it? How do you make the case to them that it's something that is not just a reality but is beneficial?
That's a tough question, because I think the answers are different depending on your socio-political situation, your economy, your geography. What I would tell somebody in Laos or Vietnam is different than what I would tell somebody in America, because here in America we've lost all kinds of manufacturing as well, and so there are many multitudes of people here who have those same questions and who have been affected in many of those same ways. And my answer here is, let's put our money into technology. We can manufacture things again, but we have to manufacture different kinds of things, not clothing, but solar panels or things like that. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I am a devotee of Paul Krugman, and so I read his column avidly. So the way I answer that is different depending on who's doing the asking, I think. And again, I don't think consumers can be held solely accountable. I think it's ridiculous to think, my book is all about denim, and I follow the making of a single pair of jeans around the world, but I don't have any illusions that people in America are going to go look up the brand before they go shopping, and make sure that they shop at a, they might do that occasionally, but shopping is an endeavor that is spontaneous. And so the responsibility really lies with people who are beyond the consumer, I think. but I think that I keep bringing up Cambodia because that's the case study that is in my book, and I lived there for 6 years, but also because it is a sweatshop-free developing country, and this is what's incredible. Even in, what are we in, 2012 now? Even in 2012, they've maintained that model, and it's known in the industry in 50 to 60 other manufacturing countries around the world. And they can look at that as a model, and it actually is working in the lives of those garment workers in Cambodia. They're paid 3-4 times what teachers and police officers are paid there. They're paid a living wage, actually, for Cambodia. It's not living to me or to you. And so I guess if I was going to encourage somebody to advocate, I would say advocate for that model. That model actually seems so far to be working.
When you're on the scene in Cambodia and other places for a particular purpose, it's common to come across other issues or things that are happening that you weren't anticipating.
Yes.
Has one of those actually turned into an area of interest for you, or maybe even a separate piece of writing?
That's a really good question, because I just feel like they've all turned into areas of interest. But the thing that was really a learning moment for me when we moved there, our first house was 2 blocks away from the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum, which in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, is one of the primary tourist spots, and people go and they learn about the genocide, and it was, there were 20,000 deaths there, terrible torture. It was an old school that had been essentially turned into a torture chamber. But at night, it closed at 5. And so from 6 o'clock on, it was a parking garage for our neighborhood. And it took me a while to get over that. Like, it's just Tuol Sleng, you just park your car at the Genocide Museum, We didn't have a car then, but, and so that was the first thing. I realized that people outside Cambodia were really holding the country to this 3-year, 8-month period, more so in some ways than the Cambodians themselves were. Like, who's not allowing them to move past that terrible, terrible moment in their history? I'm not entirely sure it's them. Mm-hmm. I also went there, I did, for example, not believing in ghosts, not really paying much attention to the spirit world. And I've always felt that was a little bit hokey. But the Cambodia, you talk to them and they would talk about certain street corners being thick with ghosts, and those were primarily where a lot of accidents happen. They talked about, when they talked about Tuol Sleng, the 3rd floor is closed to the public. And they would talk about how the 3rd floor was thick with ghosts. I did sneak up there one day, actually, and it just felt like a horrible place. As a Westerner, though, my question is it horrible because I know this history, or is it truly horrible? And so I just, I got really interested in that kind of thing. And of course, Cambodia sex trafficking is terrible. Gang rape is terrible. There's a wide assortment of social ills, but really, there's also just a lot of beauty there.
So as you look to the future, are you optimistic about where we're headed as a world, globalization and all? Or are you still waiting to
Let me see how much
make that
coffee I've had
assessment?
today. Yes and no. When I meet young people, college-age people, I actually am optimistic because they're optimistic. I guess I would say I am generally optimistic that we can do better, that we can always become better versions of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a place that you have targeted as a country or a region or something that you intend to visit that you've never visited before? Is that something you can talk about?
You should talk to my husband about that. I'm constantly searching for, we can go here. And the problem with, I've been to about 50 countries now, and the problem now is that there are so many places that are magical to me that I want to go back to. Tasmania, Tibet, South Africa. Those 3 places in particular I just loved. But I have long had a desire to go to Madagascar. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not so much into the cold weather places, but I love Madagascar. And as much as I hate to say it, I return to France again and again because I am the cliche Francophile. I just love it there. I love the countryside. I love the city. I was there last year. I learned to open a bottle of champagne with a sword. It was fantastic.
Too bad we can't demonstrate that.
I mean, we could if you had a sword and a champagne. Napoleon did that apparently. It's called sabrage. So, yeah, the world is globalization makes it small, but I think traveling makes it big.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us today, Ms. Snyder.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.